everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 250 library systems across 37 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series. Today, we are honored and excited to have New York Times bestselling author and creator of xkcd, Randall Munroe, here with us to talk about his newest book, What If 2? Additional Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions. Welcome, Randall. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Very well. We're so excited that you're here. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we dive in, though, I do want to pause for one moment and give everyone that standard quick housekeeping information that will make everything a little more smooth for our talk today. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we'll also be taking your additional questions throughout the entirety of this conversation. So when you have a direct question for Randall, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream that you're looking at on your screen. Click it at any time to submit your question. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below this stream. It's always fun to see where everyone's tuning in from. If you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, if you have to leave in 20 minutes or something, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Randall Munroe is the creator of the webcomic xkcd and author of What If, the first What If, Thing Explainer, Complicated Stuff in Simple Words, How to, Absurd Scientific Advice for Common Real World Problems, and the title of note for today, What If 2? Additional serious scientific answers to absurd hypothetical questions. After studying physics at Christopher Newport University, he got a job building robots at NASA Langley Research Center. In 2006, he left NASA to draw comics on the internet full time, thankfully. So welcome again, Randall. Again, thank you so much for being here. We had such an outpouring of questions for you. People are super excited to be here.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to hear what people were asking.
Well, let's jump in then. Our first question is from Amanda. She says, as someone in an educational profession working in the public, she has your lucky 10,000 comic pinned in her cube. So she says, thank you for celebrating the joy of learning new things. And I was wondering if you had a library story of your own to share.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in libraries, especially growing up. I went to the library a lot in Lakeville, Massachusetts, where we lived when I was in elementary school. And then after that, in Chesterfield County, Virginia, the Chesterfield County Public Library, I would spend a couple hours after school there every day. And something I just remembered when we were talking about libraries was, at one point, I think one of the librarians had a talk with my parents, like, where they said that they thought I was reading too much humor. I mean, maybe they didn't phrase it quite that way, but they were like, he's checking out a lot of books, but he's just going through the humor section, one book after another after another. And I think, like, I knew all the call numbers for all the humor sections. The comics, it was like 741.5, I think. And then I know that 818B was where I could find all their Dave Barry, which I read over and over and over. And the librarians were like, does he know there are other sections of the library? And I remember my mom told me, she said that she told the librarians, oh no, he reads other stuff, like Isaac Asimov, science fiction. He reads, it's not just humor. And the librarian was like, oh yeah, he checked out one of those a few days ago. And then my mom got home and saw that I had gotten Asimov's Treasury of Humor. So I just went on a kick for a little while there, but like, I feel like it worked out for me. Like, that's what I ended up going into. So I don't know. I think those particular Dewey Decimal sections in the library deserve a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And it certainly worked out for you. Addison, as a follow up, is asking if you were a good student in school or did you spend all of your time doodling?
Oh, I definitely spent. I was an okay student. I would sort of. I think I generally would get like every report card would have like one of every grade on it. I was good in some classes, bad in others, and it sort of changed randomly from year to year. But I definitely spent a lot of time doodling in class. Um, I found for some things sometimes that would sort of be helpful for paying attention. You know, like if you're drawing something, kind of like coloring something in or drawing methodically, like that can help with remembering what you were listening to. And so I would sometimes doodle and then look at, like, I draw a map of something and then look at the map and I could remember every part of the lecture I was hearing as I drew that.
Hmm.
But then sometimes I would get really into what I was drawing and totally tune out, and so I think, sometimes a little frustrating to my teachers.
Yeah. Um, Courtney would like to know, how did your work at NASA influence or inspire any of your writing?
Um, I think that anytime I don't know, anytime I have to learn how to use something new or work with a piece of new technology, um, I feel like the frustrations and confusions I get from doing that are often really good fodder for drawing comics or writing. Like, so, what I worked on at NASA was I did robot stuff on robotic navigation. I worked a little bit on a 3D, uh, like a virtual reality system while I was an intern the year before I worked there in a lab. And for both of those, I had to learn to use all these different tools that I had never seen before and all these different, kind of practical problems, like not the really big, exciting sky crane stuff, but just like, how do you get a file from this piece of hardware onto this piece of hardware? And that ends up being like days of work to try to get things working right. And that kind of stuff was really good, fodder for comics, comedy in general, a lot of that kind of observational stuff. Um, and I found that it's often the stuff that I found the most confusing and frustrating, that, like, if you're in the science world, you're embarrassed to talk about that. And so you're like, oh, no, I got it working. It doesn't matter. I had some frustrations, but I figured out how to make the robot work. That's what's important. But when you're doing comics and jokes and stuff, it can be helpful to, like, embrace the stuff that you found confusing, or the things that were really frustrating and that seemed weird to you, because maybe other people are frustrated about that stuff too, but no one really wants to admit it.
Absolutely. I think even across other areas, other fields, it's kind of giving permission for people to ask questions, maybe emboldening them. It's fantastic. So you describe XKCD as a webcomic of romance, sarcasm, math, and language, but its breadth is much more. And Brett says you have jokes specialized to technical fields from medicine to network architecture, and references from classical literature to esoteric incidents like the Jimmy Carter swamp rabbit attack. How do you build up all this knowledge while writing an every other day webcomic and also carrying on long term projects like authorship and speaking, like you're doing with us today?
I mean, I've got a big advantage. People will see my comics about some topic and think, oh, he drew something about this, obscure book, or this like mathematical topic. And they'll assume that I'm an expert in all of those things. But, like, from my point of view, I can just pick the one thing I know about that topic and then write a joke about it. And so I get to just kind of jump around all over the place, learning bits and pieces. And then, like, the bits and pieces that really stick in my mind, I'll go do comics about them or write about them. But it's not like it's a project, where I'm like, I have to go learn more things that I can write comics about. It's like, I'll get curious or go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole late at night, or get into trying to answer this question and read a whole bunch of scientific papers, but not for any reason. I'll just be really curious. And then later on, I'm like making jokes about it or talking about it. And then that turns into comics.
So, where do you get your inspiration for the topics that you write about? We have a ton of people asking that question.
Yeah, that's one of the most common questions for anyone who writes sort of jokes or writes in general.
Yeah.
And I've never really heard a good answer to it. Like I don't know. I think I once I briefly, when I was starting out doing comics, I talked to Dave Barry, whose books I had read in the library and was really into, and asked him. One of the things I asked was like, I want to do these comics, but how will I, like, is there some system for like making sure you have a good idea every week? And he said something like, my method is open up a blank document and stare at it in a panic until you think of something funny, or at least kind of funny, and then write it down. And after doing this now for 15 plus years, I think that's right on the mark. It's the stuff that I find, the stuff that like you read it and then it makes you want to go into the other room and tell someone the cool thing you read, or like you notice something funny and you make a joke and you want to go make it. That stuff it's like drawing a comic is like taking that and sharpening it. I remember I was always one of the students in class who would get up and go and talk to the teacher like every few minutes, as like, oh, I thought of a new thing, I want to go tell someone. I guess I'll go up to the teacher's desk. And I remember in 5th grade, one of my teachers, Mr. Whitehead, I came up and to tell him some cool thing I had figured out, or like something about a radio controlled toy that I thought was really cool. And he looked at me for a second and he was like, have you heard about the concept of quality over quantity? You should, when you're coming up to tell me things, you should try to make it fewer things and make them better.
Better ideas.
And I was like, man, really, really roasted that 5th grader. But I mean, he was clearly very tired of me telling him cool facts I had learned.
Have you ever put anything out there that you wished that you could change after the fact? Like you looked at it the next day and you were like, oh no, that's not perfect.
Yeah, I mean, now and then I'll have. I'm certainly prone to making minor math errors or spelling errors. Like I thought I was a pretty good speller until I hand wrote text for a giant audience for years, and then I learned how many words I don't spell right and never really noticed. And yeah, and then like, so I will go back and fix. I'll make change if there's some like math error or something like that. I'll correct those. But in general, I don't know. Anytime I go back and read anything I did 20 years, 10 years, 5 years ago, I'm like, oh, I would do that differently now because I'm older. But I try not to be all George Lucas about it and be like, I'm going to go back and make this, keep tinkering with this and make it right.
Yeah. Danielle is observing that you must have days when you don't feel like doing it. So how do you keep it up so regularly?
I don't know. I think that if I didn't have an update schedule, I would have like posted a handful of comics and then never posted anything again, because I would always be like, okay, now I need to wait until I've got a perfect thing to do. Like I want to wait for the perfect idea and I'll just sit around, and if once that happens, then I'll go and post that. And I think that for a lot of writers, the deadline structure helps with like forcing you to be like, okay, well, I need to pick, of all of these ideas, I need to pick the one that is seems the most promising, and then work with that and do something with it, because I'll have to have something by the end of the day. So I think that the deadline is really helpful for that, but also I don't know if there's no secret, beyond that. So
where do you start researching for your comics and your questions? Chris is saying there are plenty of questions out there that are hard to find the answers to with plenty of research on the subject, but researching something that is absurd and ridiculous, as some of your topics are, where do you even start?
Well, I guess this connects to another question that I saw someone asked about, like, how do I pick which questions are going to have an interesting answer? Or like, how do I, and in both cases, so what I'll do is when I get questions, I feel like the perfect question is one where I look at it and I don't know the answer right away, or I'm not sure what the answer is, but like I have a suspicion, and maybe like I think it's going to be something cool, or like I think, well, that would end in a disaster, right? I'm not sure what kind though. And then I will think like, how do I answer this for my own satisfaction? And so like people will send in all kinds of different questions, and like sometimes even ones that I'm not, I'll know right away for whatever reason, like I'm not going to answer this, or I'm not going to try to write this up. I'll be like, but I want to know. And then I'll go and try to calculate it or figure it out. And there are some where, they'll ask a question like, how many potatoes could fit in this stadium? And I'll be like, how many could? I mean, it's got to be around, this many quadrillion, or, well, maybe it's this. And then I'll go and get a calculator and like figure it out. Be like, okay, yeah, it's this many potatoes. All right, well, I've answered that. I'll move on now. Or it'll be a question where I'll like look into it a little and be like, I don't think there's any way to answer this, and move on. But then the ones that where I'm like, I think I can answer this, but I'm not totally sure. I'm going to have to get this data, and like maybe someone has researched this, which you could apply to it. Well, I guess I need to go and look at this field, and how do they measure this thing there? And then before I know it, like 6 hours have passed as I've gone down like rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and like gotten to an answer. And then I sort of sit back and I'm like, okay, what are the cool things that I learned in figuring this out? What cool research was there? What surprised me the most? Like, what were the things that seemed like it would work but didn't? And then I try to write all that up.
And so it does seem like Andrew's saying that you find this part of the writing process the most fun and energizing, or what part of writing, if at all, feels like a chore?
Yeah, for me, the writing, like the most exciting part is always me trying to just trying to figure out the answer, like for my own satisfaction. And proving whether my initial idea was right, or whether like something cool would happen if you did this, hypothetical thing, or just like getting to an answer, like that is a question that I had just never thought to ask before. But I think then actually writing it up, I think of it less like I'm going to do a performance for people, and more like, okay, I just did a whole bunch of work. If someone else came along and they had the same question, like, or if I could go back in time and talk to myself, like, how would I like save myself the most time? Like how do I get just the cool parts of this, like just the interesting things that I learned, and assemble them together in a way that like you could get through it quickly and learn all the cool facts, but not have to waste time like reading papers that didn't apply or trying methods that didn't work or whatever. Like how do I give someone a Cliff Notes version where they don't have to do all the work I just did? And so that's more like sort of going back and putting together like a guide to save time for anyone who comes after me. But the fun part is like doing the exploration the first time.
Yeah. So in that, say you go into a rabbit hole for 6 hours, Emmy is wondering, are there any ideas for comics or questions that you've explored that you haven't been able to do, even though you spent so much time on them?
Oh yeah, totally. There are a lot of questions that I get, and then they'll sit around for a long time as I try to answer them to my own satisfaction. Like where it's just, this is a really hard physics problem, or this, I really need to run this by someone who knows this area of science better to figure out whether I'm even on the right track. And sometimes those will sit around for like months or years until I happen to run into someone who works on, high pressure phases of ice, or this particular evolutionary phenomenon. And then now and then questions, I'll get questions where the answer turns out to be sort of in a different area, a different field than it seems at first, and it maybe isn't one where I have a good answer. A lot of people ask questions that are sort of disguised like social or political questions, like, would the country be better if you did this thing, which meant that this election went differently, and that kind of stuff. Like maybe a historian can take a stab at that, but even they seem kind of hesitant about going too deep into like applying political science in that way. I got one question that was very popular that I got for a long time was, what would happen if you released dinosaurs into the modern world, like the ones that went extinct? We have birds running around right now, but if you did a Jurassic Park and released the T-Rexes into the environment, what role would they fill? And that one seems like a really cool question. But then the more I looked into it, the more it's clear that like the pressures on dinosaurs it's less about like their natural aptitude for fitting into the ecosystem somewhere, and more like how humans manage the land, and what our hunting policies are, and you end up with, this is actually a question about poaching, and like, what would our poaching policy be toward dinosaurs? Would different countries have different policies? Like, how do you reconcile those? Like, that's not really a biology question. It's not a, it's much more of a sort of human and political question that it just feels like there are people who could weigh in on this better than me. And so I'm like, this isn't really a question about dinosaurs. This is a question about humans and policy.
Yeah. On its face, it looks like it's a question about dinosaurs, but like you said, once you dive in, it can't be only about dinosaurs, so you can't fully answer it. So this is What If 2 is a follow-up to your first What If book, and Anita is asking, what has inspired you to write volume 2?
Well, people kept sending in questions. It turns out I didn't answer all of them in the first one. And also, it's sort of interesting how things changed after I published the first What If, because when I wrote What If, it didn't really occur to me that it was something that kids might like. Like, I mean, it seems sort of silly in retrospect, but like, I was just thinking like, oh man, I found this cool question. I researched it. I want to write up the answer. But I was just sort of thinking, like, if someone like me comes along and is, or if I went back in time and could talk to myself, like, what's the information I would want to share? But of course, little kids have lots of questions, and a lot of kids I met on when I did events, people would introduce me to, like, here's my 12-year-old who read your book and has a bunch of questions, and parents would also. So like, I would start getting questions from those kids. And also parents who had read my books when they had kids of their own. People in my rough generation have lots of little kids running around, and so kids will ask why questions, or oh, why is the sky blue? Well, why does this work this way? Why is there water here? And parents, when they hit a question where they're like, well, okay, I don't know the answer to that, would sometimes start sending them in to me. And I really liked this. Like, this ended up being really cool, because I feel like kids in general ask almost better questions than adults. So some of my favorite questions in What If 2 were ones that were sent in by little kids or by parents on behalf of their kids.
So Balin is asking, based on the comment that you've made about and adding kids' questions to What If 2, is, have you considered writing a version of your book that was specifically child focused?
Yeah, I think that could be cool. I always, I don't know. I feel like I don't know. I don't know. I know people who write for children specifically, and it seems like it's its whole own thing with its own considerations. And like, I'm not an educator or a teacher, or like, I feel like I don't know how to sort of tune my answers to be the most accessible to kids. Like I just sort of think, well, like what would be most interesting to me? I'll put that out there and then like see who enjoys that the most. But I think that could be really cool. And I do like those questions a lot. And I mean, so with What If too, I just tried to include more of those. But that was almost, it wasn't that the answer was necessarily like written for a kid, for the kids who wrote it. It was just the kid's question was really good. And now I have this question too.
Yeah.
One of my favorite questions came from, it's the one I started What If 2 with. And it came from a 5-year-old named Amelia who had asked, what would happen if I filled the solar system with soup out to Jupiter? And I like this because like I found that especially after I wrote What If, and people sort of would learn that like, oh, if you can set up a what if scenario that sounds simple, but then it has these catastrophic consequences. Like if you threw a baseball at 90% of the speed of light, it would actually end up creating a new, basically like a similar to a nuclear explosion. Like the ball would undergo fusion, you'd get a mushroom cloud, it would completely vaporize the entire baseball field. And it's really fun. And like, it's fun to explore these scenarios. And so adults will ask questions where they're like trying to get cool science stuff in there. So they'll be like, what would happen if you took a train, but you made it go at the speed of light into a volcano, and then the train, there was another train made of antimatter, and those collided. Oh, and then, but the whole thing is relativistic. And so you have also a computer on the train that's doing a calculation, and they'll like construct these scenarios where they're clearly have an answer in mind, where they're like, I want to make a cool scenario. And then kids will ask questions like, what if I filled the solar system with soup? Which is like both I think a much more fun question, and also ultimately much more destructive. Like if you were trying to make something catastrophic and dramatic, the filling the solar system with soup will immediately create a black hole and start vacuuming up not just our entire solar system, but nearby stars. It's much more catastrophic than anything you could do with a volcano. And it just came from a kid saying, here's a question that occurred to me. I want to know the answer. And I thought, that's a good question. I want to know the answer too.
It was a great way to open the book too. So speaking of destruction, I just want to talk about the fact that you open the book with a disclaimer, do not try this at home. Have you heard from people actually trying to perform some of these experiments?
For the most part, no. It's fun to put in that disclaimer, and I like the disclaimer because it's sort of saying the author is a cartoonist who likes when things explode dramatically, so he does not have your best interests in mind. Do not attempt to do any of these things. But I'm also, I often, there are a lot of questions that you can test practically. And the ones that people wrote in where I was like, well, you could try this, you could see. I would often find that, for example, especially the Mythbusters would tend to have tried those, and if they haven't tried it, then some irresponsible teenagers on YouTube have tried it. You can go and see the answer. And so what I tried to do is show how even for questions where you can't easily test them, like where there isn't a way to do this, physics and math and these calculations on paper can actually get you an answer. They can show you how to solve these. And so I sort of think of the kinds of questions I pick are the ones that are impractical or impossible to test practically. So, you shouldn't fill the solar system with soup. That would be very bad. But also, I'm not really worried that Amelia is going to do that. So the disclaimer, it's very much meant, but for a lot of the questions, it's sort of it's not even an option. There was one. I find that the things that people do try are sort of what surprised me. Like they won't be the part that I think that they're gonna test. But there was one chapter in the first What If book where someone asked if they could cook a steak by dropping it from a really high altitude. And when things fall from space, they go really fast, and when they hit the atmosphere, they heat up and like meteors or spacecraft, and And that heat, they were saying, well, if you drop the steak from just the right height, can you get it to heat up enough that it cooks, but not so hot that it disintegrates? And I had fun trying to answer this, modeling how a steak would fall through the atmosphere, and looking at, there are some studies on there's lots of studies on aircraft, how they heat up as they move through the air at high speeds. It was a little bit harder to figure out how the steak would rotate in the air. And then I found, okay, even if I can model what's the heat going to be on the front of the steak, how long will it take the heat to propagate through the steak? Like if you have this much heat at the surface of a steak on this side, how quickly will the heat propagate through to the other side? And so then I start going through, I'm like, okay, these aeronautics papers don't have this. Maybe I could look at what's the thermal conductivity of steak? I guess maybe a food science journal will have this, like maybe there's industrial food processing. And I end up, but like three-dimensional heat flow is like really annoying calculus. And I was spent like an hour or some long amount of time just like struggling to like set up the equations right. And I kept getting lost and it would frustrate me. And then I realized that oh, there's an entire different branch of science devoted to figuring out what happens to a steak when you apply heat to one side of it, and realized I could just go get a cookbook and look up the answer there. And so then I felt kind of sheepish and closed all of the thermal conductivity papers I had been reading, and just found how to cook a steak. But there was one part that I couldn't figure out, which was how, if a steak is moving fast enough to heat up, it means it's moving at like Mach 2 or 3 or 4. And so steaks at hypersonic, things moving at hypersonic speeds tend to flutter weirdly, or they undergo a lot of stress, or and figuring out how the steak would behave while falling at hypersonic speeds was really tricky. There are some papers on how debris from breaking up, when they deorbit satellites, they model how the debris is going to fall. But none of those really applied to raw meat. And so I spent a little bit trying to figure it out. I figured out the steak will probably fall with its flat face first, because things that move at hypersonic speeds tend to sort of present their highest area surface forward. But I didn't know whether it would flutter or tumble or just be torn apart. And so I just put a note in the chapter where I said, I don't know how a steak would behave at hypersonic speeds, whether it would flutter, it might just break itself apart. And I couldn't find any good research on this. So, if you happen to have a wind tunnel and some free time, please let me know if you want to gather any data on this. And when I put it in, I was sort of putting it as a joke, well, I couldn't find any data on this, but I'm sure someone out there can go gather some. And I didn't really think about it again. But a couple of years later, I heard from these two scientists at the University of Manchester who said, hey, we're PhD students. We were doing our dissertation on the behavior of bluff bodies in hypersonic flows using this big wind tunnel here. And it was a Friday afternoon, and we had finished our research for our dissertations, but we still had some hours on the wind tunnel. And so one of us went to the corner store and got a steak, and we wired it up and decided to gather some data. And then they sent me videos of what happens to a steak in a wind tunnel. And it was really cool. It was, I would say, overall, quantitatively, I feel like it validated my predictions. It was like the surface of the steak did heat up, get cooked, get blasted away, but the interior of the steak stayed raw and cold, which is exactly what I wrote in the article. But qualitatively, they sent some after pictures of the steak after they had, taken it out of the hypersonic winds, and it looked a lot less appetizing than I had imagined. I imagined it being like a meteor with a smooth cooked front, but it looked more like it had been in a clothes dryer for a couple of hours.
Oh.
It looked ragged. So, in the article I said, I don't think this is a good way to cook steak. But now that I've seen the actual result of someone trying to cook a steak this way, I think it's definitely not a good way to cook steak.
we had Benjamin ask which of the scenarios in What If 2 did you think would be most likely to happen? Or as Donald puts it, do you feel that any of the what if hypotheticals could actually materialize into what now instead of what if? And I think it's funny that it goes along with that, the steak story. You maybe didn't expect anybody to go out there and actually see what would happen to a steak, but they did. So what now?
Yeah, there are a few questions that are things you can test practically. There are things. One of the chapters that I liked a lot was someone asked what would happen if they hung on the blade of a helicopter while it tried to start up. And this is something I looked around a little. You can sometimes find, especially in the military, you'll find bored, people who have nothing to do and they're at a military base and they'll like take some video or do some stunt and then get in huge trouble later. I didn't find anyone who had tried this. But when I did a bunch of calculations to try to figure out what would happen, it's like so anticlimactic that it's like, I feel like once I've written up the description of what would happen, it's like, oh, that actually doesn't look that much fun. Like it would be that exciting. Because what would happen is when the helicopter blade starts turning, the rotor, even when it looks like it's going really slowly, you would experience a lot of centrifugal force. You'd be flung outward pretty hard. And so even if you had a really good grip on the blade, the rotor would make like one full turn at most before you lost your grip and just like fell off onto the ground. And so it's like, all right, well, you'd fall on the ground and probably, sprain an ankle or depending on how big the helicopter is, you could probably break something or get injured. But like, it wouldn't do anything cool or science-y. There was one really cute question that I liked, because now and then questions will suggest something you can do to test them. One question I got was from someone, it was from a couple, and one of them was like significantly taller than the other. And so they said, how much more daylight does the taller person experience?
Huh.
And if you stand by the beach and you're watching the sunset or rise, the taller person does see the sun appear a split second before the shorter person, which is weird. And so like over a lifetime, you can work out like every extra inch of height gives you, this many milliseconds a day on average of more sunlight. And so over the course of your life, it might add up to like 30 seconds more, which is like kind of, it's funny. There are other things that go along with being tall or short that will probably also, affect, like if you're taller, you might get more sunlight, but you also hit your head more often on beams going downstairs. But, and in the book though, I said, if you want to experience more sunlight, you don't need to worry about how tall you are because you can just move up, like if you stand up somewhere higher up, you'll get the sunrise significantly earlier than if you were down at near sea level. And this is something that I've actually tried this on beaches. If you have a beach where there's like a cliff going down to the water, I was watching a meteor shower with some friends one night, and we were out all night. So the sun was about to start rising, and we looked at what time sunrise was. And we got to talking about it and realized, yeah, if you're standing at the top of the cliffs, you'll see the sunrise like 30 seconds before, 20 seconds before it would rise if you were down on the beach. And because you can do out all the geometry and figure out, because when the sun peaks up over the horizon, the light first hits the high up parts while the lower parts are still in the shadow of the earth. And so so we were sitting there and we're thinking, okay, so if we go up to the top and we see the sunrise, there's like 20 seconds before it would rise from the bottom of the steps. And that means that if you start at the top, I think we could run down those steps in like 20 seconds. So could we see two sunrises? And we thought about it and we're like, I think we could. And so we, after this hour of lying there doing this calculations as we watched for meteors, we were like, all right, it's just about sunrise. And so we went up to the top of the steps and watched, and then we saw the sun peak over the horizon. Okay, sunrise. And then we started running down the steps. And as we ran down, we saw the sun disappear again.
Wow.
And then we got to the bottom of the steps, stood there, and we're like, yeah, no sunrise yet. And then a few seconds later, the sun rose again, broke the horizon. And like, that was really cool.
That's really
You know,
cool.
it's not a, you know, like, I do think people should try that. It's really fun, you know? And so I illustrated that when the person asked about how much more sun do taller people see than shorter people. I showed how, like, the higher up you are, the earlier you see the sun rise and the later you see it set. And you can use this to experience multiple sunrises or sunsets. And I thought that was really cool. Sunsets are harder because you have to run up the stairs.
Yeah.
But for sunrises, you have to wake up early. So, you know, downsides to both approaches.
Yeah, pick your poison. So we're getting a lot of questions about xkcd. So I'm gonna ask a couple of them, transition a little bit. Carla is asking, you have a few distinct characters that you write within xkcd. Did you start this intentionally, or was it a byproduct of wanting a dialogue structure for humor? Have you created full backstories for these characters?
No, I think, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, oh, well, here are two different views you could have. I want to draw people having a conversation between them. Or, you know, here's here's a good joke, but I need the other person to say the right thing for my punchline to work. Like, I'll think of, you know, if you're someone who like tries to make jokes a lot, you'll think like there's the phenomenon of, like, you're at a party and someone says something and then you think of something later that's really clever and you're like, oh, if only I had been there, that would have been a good joke. And with comics, you can pretend that you thought of it all at once. But you also, there's the reverse where you're like, oh, I thought of a really good comeback, but it would only work if someone said this first thing. And so then it's like, aha, I'm going to make another person to say this first thing. Like, but I also try, I don't know, I generally, unless I have to, you know, for the sake of something, I draw figures where, like, they don't have names, they don't have continuity. I was a big fan of The Far Side growing up. And I sort of like that format where, like, you introduce the characters and, like, maybe they're recurring characters, maybe you find them in previous ones, but, like, it's not like, it's not a canon that you have to know to understand what's going on. You know, it's like, oh, these could be new people every time. And then I think that can sometimes make it easier to kind of like see yourself in it or apply it to you.
It certainly makes it easier to become a fan of the comic at any point in time. You don't have to know the backstories. You can start.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, there's, I think comics that, like, have an ongoing story or, you know, play with characters, and then they can do, you know, they'll do callbacks to their previous things. And, you know, you can do a lot of fun stuff with that. It's a neat format too. I've liked doing things with the more Far Side model. I feel like works better for me.
Jeffrey wants to know, how do you get your stick figures so perfect?
Oh, I'm drawing them since I was a little kid. And also I would totally be like, oh, this figure, the blob of its head just seems a little wrong. I'm going to redraw it 5 times until it looks right. I don't know. I think with any of these creative, anytime you're making something, like, I find this is something true with working on software as well. Like, things that seem simple end up being way more work than you think they're going to be sometimes. And like whenever I learn to use a new software library, or, you know, learn how something is built, I'll think like, wait, you really have to spend this much time doing this, like, mundane task? There's no way I could learn to, like, it's going to take me all day just to learn to do this one step to, you know, draw this kind of shape, or to, like, create this data structure. Like, if it takes me all day to learn this one very, very small step, there's no way I could build something big and cool. And so it always feels like it's harder than it should be. And math is this sort of the same way. Like, oh man, I'm spending so much time learning to do this one math, solve this one kind of equation. And then that only lets me solve these simple, problems that aren't even like nearly as complicated as the problems we're trying to solve. Like this seems totally impossible. And I feel like what I've learned over all of these areas is like everything is weirdly hard. But then also, all right, you spend all day learning to do this thing, and then the next day you spend all day learning to do a different thing, and the first thing is easier, and then you spend all day, and it turns out there's a lot of days, like, you know, maybe there's not as many as there should be, but there's like you can if you keep at something, you like get surprisingly far with these steps that feel way too slow. And so in a lot of different things, I found that like when stuff seems confusing or complicated, that's it's okay. It's not you. Stuff is actually confusing and complicated. But then if you keep at it, slowly it starts making sense and starts being easier.
Do you have a favorite character or comic strip? Alan would like to know. And is there one that you've had a hard time keeping up with because it's not been so easy to write?
Is this
for xkcd?
Yeah. I don't know. I think to the extent that there are recurring characters, I've always been really fond of. There's this little figure in a beret, which I feel like often has the sort of. They're just like some of my favorite, a little bit weirder or like sillier strips. I think those are some of my favorites. Whenever I sort of feel particularly like looking at the world like with a very simple childlike view, I try to channel that.
Another follow-up question from a different Alan, spelled differently. It says that it seems to him that you pull many xkcd ideas out of the brains of sysadmins the world over. Are these personal experiences, or do you just have a lot of friends who are sysadmins?
I do. I mean, there's a point when I feel like every single person I knew was an SRE, like a site reliability engineer, and so I definitely hear a lot about about that, that sort of field, but also just trying to get any piece of technology working in my own life has always been. I've always had a hard time with. I always have very weird technology problems, and then I go and try to solve them. I'll be like, well, I figured out a good way to solve it, and that solution will like create 3 new problems. And then by the end, I'm having technology problems that, like, as far as I can tell, nobody else in the world has managed to have. Like, I'll Google and be like, does anyone else have their camera turn off when you put too much an image with too much red saturation in it? And they'll be like. And I'll Google this, and Google will just be like, "Are you okay?" The worst is when I find one other person out there in the world. Like there'll be like one result from like 2009 of someone who got the same error message as me, and they post on a forum, and be like, "I somehow got this thing to produce this error. Does anyone else know about this?" And then there are no replies, and I'm like. This is the only other person who's done this. I want to know did they survive? What happened to them? And so I'll like, I really want to track these people down and just be like, what did you know? What did you find out? And then sometimes when I solve the problem, I'm like, I need to go find this person. I'm sure they do not have this technology anymore. They've moved on in their life. They've probably like moved to another country, started anew. Haven't thought about this in years. But just in case they're still like wondering about it, I want to let them know I solved it. It was this piece of software was doing this thing and creating this signal that like interfered with this. And you can fix it by changing this one configuration. I've run into so many problems like that, and like. I'll end up spending way more time trying to troubleshoot them than if I had just like not tried to solve the problem in the first place. Like if I had just like 3 problems back, just accepted, oh yeah, this thing doesn't work. oh, well, it should work and it doesn't, and that's frustrating, but move on with your life. If I did that more often, I think I would probably be overall happier and healthier, but maybe have fewer ideas for comics.
Ahad, based on that, the wacky technology issues, Ahad says many of your comics highlight wacky or crazy cool technology concepts, from robotics to smartphones to web apps. Are there any of these ideas that you've ever really wanted to make for yourself, or maybe even actually tried to make if you had the time to do so?
Yeah, I actually did early on. I had an idea. I had always thought it would be cool to put a robot inside a hamster ball so that it like rolled around. Um, After working long enough with wheels, you just start to hate how they get tangled in things, or how like there are a whole bunch of wheel related problems. Like you drive over a piece of string and suddenly the string gets wrapped around your axle, and like there's no way for the robot to fix that. And so I was like, what'd be great is if you just had a ball around the robot and it could roll around like it's in a hamster ball, and you could even make it in some ways go on water. And then I thought of a way you could maybe mount the camera on top so it stuck to it. And so I thought about, okay, well, you could do that with magnetic couplings. And then so the camera would always be on top, the robot would be inside the hamster ball, and it could roll around, but it could stay balanced because the bottom would have a weight. And I thought that was a neat idea, but then it also seemed like a lot of work. And I was like, that would be really cool, but I don't really have a reason to make a robot right now. That's a lot of work, but I can draw it. I can make a comic about it. And then that almost felt like almost as satisfying. Like I get to show off the cool idea, but don't have to spend like 2 months fiddling with like soldering things to PCB, like tiny chips and stuff. Reading Raspberry Pi tutorials, doing all the motor controllers, all that stuff. Like I feel like with engineering, I always feel like I'm only doing it grudgingly. Like I just want the cool result. Yeah. And so I did a comic about this, and I found that was like almost as much fun. I get to share the cool idea, show what it might look like, and then other people can enjoy it too. And I think there were a few attempts. So a few people out there built them, but mostly I didn't really hear anything more about that for then a few years. And then until I was delighted when The Force Awakens came out, and they had a robot, BB-8, which was, first of all, incredibly cute, one of the best robot designs in cinema in ever. And it worked. They had built a practical version of it, and it worked very similarly to the design that I drew. So I don't know if someone who worked on Star Wars, saw that comic at some point, thought it was a cool idea. I saw some people talking about that. So I don't know if it was just someone who had that same idea, or had someone who actually saw my comics and made that. But either way, I'm just like delighted that it exists, because I was like, I feel like this would look really cute, little ball rolling around with a little head on it, kind of wobbly. And I am so gratified to see that, yes, it is actually really cute. It's a cool robot. I'm glad someone made it. And now I'm glad I don't have to make it, because like I said, soldering is a huge pain.
Hannah would like to know what excites you scientifically right now. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a popular or heavily researched field.
I don't know. I think for a long time, exoplanets have been really exciting. And now with the James Webb Space Telescope, like that's a whole field that was when I was born, we didn't know if there were planets around other stars at all. And then they found the first ones in the 90s, and now they've found like thousands and thousands of them. And I really want to know what those planets are like. So I'm like always excited whenever there's a new measurement or result. And the Webb telescope is going to allow us to do some spectroscopy of other planets' atmospheres. We're getting some new results now. I think that definitely in the last few years, especially, I've I've gotten really I've really enjoyed learning more about the immune system. That's an area that, I had a background in physics, and I was always a little bit intimidated by biology, and found chemistry kind of baffling. But the more, I've learned about how the immune system works, the more I'm like, whoa, this is one of the coolest things in the universe. Like, this is the way it works, the way it develops antibodies. It's like you've got a whole second brain running, just doing the work of developing antibodies to attack things, which is sort of, it's like software development or engineering, but it's like happening on its own to protect you, and that's really cool. And I can see, now when I meet people who went into biology or study immunology, I'm like, oh, I get it. I get why you got sucked into this, you know. And so I think that's really cool, and like very, very useful, for very important, for COVID, for other viruses, and then for lots of other cool stuff that we're learning about that it turns out the immune system is involved in, like cancer and things like that. So immunology, really cool, really complicated. Big fan.
How do you think of yourself and your work in relation to wider efforts to communicate science? Eric is saying, are there lessons that you can share with other science communicators that you care to divulge?
I don't know. I think one of the big lessons for me from seeing like people try to talk about scientific ideas, and like watching scientists try to talk to lay people, is that it's really hard to simplify things and make things understandable without condescending to people. And so I think that like when that's like a big pitfall that anyone, science communicators or scientists trying to talk to the public, will be, is they'll think, okay, well, I need to explain this to someone who's, well, they don't even understand this basic idea. Okay, I guess I have to explain that too. And like, wait, have they never heard of this? Okay, so I'm explaining this to someone who's really just not smart at all. And like they'll like kind of get like condescending and dismissive of people, and like say, well, like and say stuff like, well, I'm sure most of you know about this, but maybe if you haven't heard of that, then here's an explanation, that where like I think that can be really off-putting if you're a person who didn't understand that thing or didn't know that thing. And so I always try to remind people, when you're talking to people about something that you know a lot about, like it's your field of expertise or your area, you have to understand that other people, they're not stupid. They're not ignorant. They're doing their own stuff. They have their own stuff going on. You are getting a little bit of their attention as they turn to look at your field, as your area. But you have to put things in terms that like you have to respect their knowledge or their understanding, and like not like try to simplify things, but not condescend to them or be judgmental about stuff they don't know. I think that's really important, because if you do that, if you act surprised that someone doesn't know something, or complain, or say, well, like, oh, I better put this in really simple terms because this person doesn't know the basics, so I'll have to talk to them like they're a small child, that can really be off-putting. And really, like, even if people don't know about your field, everyone can tell when they're being condescended to. And so I try really hard to think of it not like the people I'm talking to, don't know stuff, but just think like they're doing different stuff. They're busy. They have their own things that they know about that I don't know about. And I'm trying to give them the quick, here's the important stuff to know from this field. But approaching them like they're a person who's just as much a thinking competent adult as me. They just have a different area, different stuff they do, but it's just as legitimate and valid. So I don't know. I really think that like learning how to like share your excitement about things without feeling like you're condescending to someone who knows less than you is really a needle that it's sort of important to thread.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice for society at large, and not just scientists, but it's definitely important advice altogether. Let's ask our one final question. It was submitted by Julie, but the question is from Liam. He's a 9-year-old from Ms. Herrera's 3rd grade class. Liam asks, what's your favorite book? Are you going to write more books, and what will they be about?
Oh, I don't know. Favorite book. I feel like my favorite book has changed so many times over my life. I really liked, I know as a kid, I read a lot of, science fiction, that kind of thing. But I always really liked A Wrinkle in Time in particular, which I felt like really captures this idea of like, there's a big, really wonderful and kind of awe-inspiring universe out there that is so far beyond what we can understand that it's like breathtaking. But it also paired it with the idea that even if you're an awkward kid who is confused by a lot of basic stuff, like if you think about it hard enough, you can sort of understand pieces of how the universe works. And that's something that I feel like Madeleine L'Engle really, really captured in a way that that I felt like not a lot of other authors have. But yeah, no, I don't have any specific projects, books to announce or anything like that. I've always, whenever I finish a book, I'm like, okay, that's enough of that. No more writing, but then like a little bit later, someone's like, hey, I have this question. I'm like, oh, that's a good question. Okay, I'll tackle this. So I have a couple of different projects that I'm working on like that, and we'll see which one ends up coming to fruition first.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. This has been a ton of fun. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to more of them.
Well, I mean, there were so many good questions too, but that's okay. I'm sure everybody, all the comments coming in, everybody's having a great time listening to the conversation. But I also want to extend that huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into today's Author Talk. Of course, without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Randall's book. We look forward to seeing you all on February 10th when we chat with, February 9th, when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Lena Harper about her newest book in the Witches of Thistlegrove series, Back in a Spell. And again on February 16th when we speak to National Book Award finalist Grace M. Cho about her memoir, Tastes Like War. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Have a fantastic day.